We're on to session 3, extant animal assemblages and past migrations and extinctions. And we're going to hear virtually from Ralph Eshelman. Ralph, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. Great. Okay. Then in that case, I think we are ready to begin, and I turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you very much.
Hold on, let me read your title, though. Excuse me. Pleistocene Vertebrates in the Chesapeake Bay Region. Okay.
Good enough.
Your turn.
All right. Well, a very good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Chesapeake. It's a beautiful sunny day, a balmy 42 degrees. Don't you guys wish you were all here? I want to start out by thanking Tom and Deborah, who did a very good job of summarizing the Chesapeake for me. I just want to reemphasize a couple of things because it's important when we think about the faunas that were here in the late Pleistocene, the Holocene, and also the present fauna. The bay is about 200 miles long, so we're talking about a big area. But what's even more important, that you see that red circle right there? I live right in the middle of that, on the Patuxent River, about 2 miles from the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. But when we look at the watershed, and both Tom and Deborah have already mentioned this, the Chesapeake is much, much bigger. Unlike my other two colleagues in this session who are only going to be dealing with one state, I'm actually dealing with 6 states. And to make it easier for all of us, I'm going to concentrate primarily on Virginia and Maryland because those are the states that really border the Chesapeake Bay. But I wanted to make sure that everybody understood that parts of Delaware, parts of eastern West Virginia, a major portion of Pennsylvania, and even part of New York are part of the Chesapeake watershed. I'm going to try to concentrate on the Chesapeake Bay and the surrounding area of that bay. I think many of you are familiar with these types of illustrations. We've seen many of them already today. This is by Darren Lowry, and this is showing you the Chesapeake Bay region 13,000 years ago. And you'll notice that there's a blue line coming down the Susquehanna River, right down through here. And that dark green that you see represents where sea level is today. So we're talking about significant differences in the depth of the bay and really the breadth and the width of the Chesapeake Bay versus what it was 13,000 years ago and what it is like today. We can make another comparison by going back about 8,000 years. And if you look at that blue line that represents the Susquehanna River, you can begin to see that part of it is now being flooded. We now have different types of marine animals that are able to come into this area, essentially an estuarine area, a mixing of the fresh water with the salt water. So that's another new environment that we didn't have 13,000 years ago. And then if we look at about 4,000 years ago, you begin to see kind of what the Chesapeake Bay looks like today. Much broader, much deeper, but you can still see some vestiges of that green, which represents that darker green that represents the current confines of the Chesapeake. Big, big changes over the last 13,000 years. One of the first papers that deals with some of the animals that were affected by all of this was a paper by Frank C. Whitmore, Jr., 1967. It was published in Science, Elephant Teeth from the Continental Shelf. And if you look at the figure down below, you'll notice that right off the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay is a group of, oops, went too far, is a group of triangles and a circle that represent known mastodon and mammoth teeth that have been recovered by hard shell clammers that are dredging off on the shelf. If you look on the right-hand side, you can even see more examples of some of these large mega animals that lived back in the late Pleistocene, early Holocene. So the continental shelf was land at that time. All of these animals were living there at that time. And of course, today they're not able to do that because it's flooded. It's a completely different environment. This is an example of one of those teeth that was used by Whitmore when he did his study. And this is now in the collections of the National Museum at the Smithsonian Institution. This is one of Garrison et al.'s illustrations, and I like it a lot. It shows the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And if you look at the orange, those are the paleochannels of the Susquehanna River. And so what you're seeing here is actually a sequence of channels that have migrated from the north to the south. And then if you look offshore, you can see two ovals that are light green. And Garrison et al. Are suggesting they may be possible Clovis age settlement areas, which would then be on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean that is now submerged as part of the continental shelf. What I'd like to do now is talk a little bit about Maryland and establish a baseline of the vertebrate fauna from the 16th century, and then compare it to the vertebrate fauna of the late Pleistocene and the early Holocene. Now, the reason I'm saying 16th century for that comparison is that there was a study done by the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1986. It was a 2-day seminar, similar to what we're doing today. And they were talking about the Quaternary and the changes that took place in Virginia. And in order to make this comparison, they chose to use the 16th century. They chose that because they thought that even though Europeans had been here by, let's say, late 16th century, they hadn't done enough alteration that they made significant change to the fauna. And so I've chose to do the same thing, both for Maryland and for Virginia in this particular review. So one of the ways that we can do this is we can look at the written record. Now, unfortunately, in Maryland, we don't have many written records that go back to the 16th century. So I'm showing you some early 17th century, but this is one by Henry Fleet. And in 1632, he talks about the deer, the buffaloes, which of course we mean the bison, the bears and the turkeys. And he says that the woods do swarm with them. There were so many of these that were present. And if you look at Father Andrew White in 1635, he was located at the capital of the colony of Maryland at that time. And he was very diverse in his description of the different types of animals that were here. He described also the plants and some of the trees. And he also mentions the buffaloes and some of the other types of mammals that are here. He goes into the types of birds that were there at that time. He even talks about some of the types of fishes. And although they're not vertebrates, he even mentions the crabs, the oysters, the cockles, and the mussels. You can also look at archaeological sites, and these are just 3 of over 50 known archaeological sites in the Patuxent River alone, just one tributary of the Chesapeake. And I've chose 3 known archaeological sites from this river. The first one is Pig Point, and it dates from the Archaic period, and you can see the times that are there to help you that if you're not familiar with that term, and some of the evidence that has been recovered from these archaeological sites. So we have plants such as hickory nuts. We also have white perch and yellow perch, which are still found in the Patuxent River today. If you go to Thomas Point into the Cumberland site, these are both woodland sites. The Cumberland site is literally within view of where I am right now. And you can see, again, many different types of plants that were here at that time and being described. Some of the vertebrates included the toadfish, the box turtle, the owl, doesn't just tell you what kind of an owl, the crow, the robin, white perch again, and deer. All of these animals and these plants are here today in the Patuxent River and in the Chesapeake. In 1950, there was a fellow by the name of Romeo Mansuetti. Isn't that a great word? And he published in the Maryland Naturalist on the extinct and vanishing mammals of Maryland and the District of Columbia. And he did something that I thought was kind of interesting. These are drawings that he did himself. And then in the caption of each of these drawings, he would indicate if the animal was extirpated, or whether it was still present in Maryland, or whether it was rare. And so here you can see the elk extirpated. Down below you see the Virginia deer. And he says once extirpated, now common. He also takes a look at other types of mammals. For example, there's the marten and the fisher, extirpated. The black bear, uncommon. Interesting, since 1950, the black bear has become more common than it was at that time. He also talks about some of the large cats, such as the cougar, extirpated, the lion, extirpated, the bobcat, extant, but uncommon. And then there's other types of mammals. We can go on and on and on, but it's just interesting to make these comparisons. The other thing that Mansuetti did is he mentioned some of the marine mammals. If we're talking about the Chesapeake Bay, how can we leave out the marine mammals? For example, there's dolphins. They're very common in the bay today, and actually they're more common, we believe, than they were 50 years ago. But we also have seals that can be found in parts of Maryland. So although Mansuetti is dealing with the entire state of Maryland, most of these animals, not all, but most of them are also found in the Chesapeake Bay region. One animal that he did not name was the nutria, which was native to South America. It was brought into the United States in 1889. And after 1950, it became so common in the Chesapeake Bay that there was an eradication program because it was destroying the marshes. And it's pretty much under control today, at least in the state of Maryland. He also mentions bison and refers to them as inhabiting the glades of Western Maryland as late as 1774. Next came another individual by the name of Paradiso, and this is almost 20 years later, 1969. And he looked at all of the mammals within the state. And he mentioned that in addition to new species that had been introduced, such as the black rat, the Norway rat, and the house mouse, and the Sitka deer, he didn't mention nutria because they weren't really that common at that time. But he also lists 7 extirpated species. And I'm going to just play here for a minute. And then roughly speaking, what we can say based on the work of these two individuals, that the potential 16th century taxa that existed in Maryland was about 67 species that were native to the state. In the late Pleistocene, before the mega mammals became extinct, there were about 73 species, so there were more. And this is interesting because when we come to Virginia, it's going to be just about the reverse. And the reason for that is Virginia has actually been better studied than has Maryland. So many of these species that we're talking about, I want to emphasize, although they live through most of Maryland, most of them also are found in the Chesapeake, but not all. Current studies that are underway that are going to help to fill this void is number one, Steve Sheffield at the Bowie State University is working on an updated Mammals of Virginia. That'll be published by Johns Hopkins University. And then also Eshelman et al. Is working on a paper that will be very similar to what Virginia did in 1986 on the quaternary vertebrates of Maryland. I just wanted to mention there was another paper that was done relatively recently. This is in 2015, and it was on the carnivores of Delmarva Peninsula. And as you can see in the graph, he points out in the columns the different animals that they studied and took a look at when they were first recorded in the Delmarva Peninsula and their current status. And what's interesting about this is that Delmarva, which is part of Delaware and Maryland on the eastern shore and a little piece of Virginia on the eastern shore, is somewhat different than what we find on the western shore of the United States. For example, Neutrina is relatively or was relatively common there, whereas it's hardly unknown on the western shore. The other thing they point out, the coyote, they speculate that maybe when the gray wolf was extirpated from this area, the coyote came in to occupy that habitat. Of the 10 species that they identified, 4 of them are likely extirpated in Delmarva, but they're not necessarily extirpated in the rest of the state of Maryland. And that includes the black bear, the cougar, the gray wolf, and the bobcat. So here's the symposium that was done by Virginia. Again, this is in 1986. This is the contents of all of the presentations that were made in that particular symposium. And if you look at the red box that I've got here, all of those presentations involved quaternary vertebrates of Virginia. So you can see they've done a much better job of documenting what's going on in Virginia than we have here in Maryland. And one of those papers is available on academia if anybody's interested in taking a look at it. And it talks about the quaternary vertebrate localities that were known at that time in Virginia. There were 77 quaternary sites known, and they represent 100 taxa of birds and 93 taxa of mammals. So that's more than what we have presently known in Maryland. Many of these localities are represented only by single specimens. 74% of the taxa were recovered from karst features such as caves and fissures. This is important because that means that 74% of these taxa are not really known from the Chesapeake as fossils. Most of these localities are outside of the Chesapeake Bay, as I just described. Localities within the Chesapeake only represent about 12 localities. So what I'm really emphasizing here is that when you look at a statewide fauna, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a fair representation of what we have in the Chesapeake Bay. The known fauna in the Chesapeake Bay is depauperate compared to what it is for the rest of the state. 17 extirpated species now live in a northerly environment than we have today. And there's a list of what they are. The Arctic shrew is certainly a good example of that. Also caribou. And then 3 extirpated species are known to live more westerly than they do today. The whooping crane, the 13-line ground squirrel, and the bison. And then there's at least 19 extinct species, and this includes birds and even the passenger pigeon, which we know is extinct due to humans since they've occupied this area, as well as many other examples that you can see that I've outlined in yellow. So there's a greater known number of extinct species from Virginia than what we have from Maryland, again, because Virginia is better studied. There's one species not reported from Virginia, but probably was present, and that's the Carolina parakeet. 3 exotic species that were mentioned in this symposia are the starling, the brown rat, and the house mouse. And I'm adding 2 that they left out that they should have included, and that's the nutria and also the Sitka deer. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into this. I just wanted to point out to you that this is a table that compares the late Pleistocene fauna on the left with the potential 16th century fauna on the right, and you can see the feeding habitats in the middle. And if you look, you can notice that most of these taxa are known from both faunas, but not all. So here's a summary of that table. In the late Pleistocene, there were 85 taxa, including Homo sapiens. In the 16th century, there were only 73 taxa, including Homo sapien. If you look at the extinct taxa, there were 15 in the late Pleistocene, none in the 16th century. If you look at taxa that are no longer present in the 16th century, but were present in the late Pleistocene, there's 26 taxa, and then the reverse of that, 16 taxa that were known in the late Pleistocene that are not now known in the 16th century are 16 taxa. And then one of the interesting differences between the two is that if you look at chryseides, which are the mice, there's only 2 that are known from the late Pleistocene, but there's 7 that are known that live in this area today. If you look at the avicolids, which are like your voles and your muskrats, there were 10 in the late Pleistocene, and there's only 6 today. So this is a big difference, a bigger difference than we typically find in the rest of the types of mammals. And that needs some better study to better understand exactly why that's going on. And there's also the pika, which is also called the whistling rabbit, which is known from the Rocky Mountains, but has been found in 6 locations in the Appalachian Mountains from cave deposits. It never occupied the Chesapeake Bay per se, But here's an example of an animal that now has very, very different geographical distributions than what it did during the late Pleistocene. And then I just wanted to emphasize that some of these Pleistocene deposits are not well dated, and probably many of them are much earlier in time and do not truly represent late Pleistocene. Al Homan, in this particular symposium, also did a study of the amphibians and the reptiles. And in his abstract, he pointed out a dilemma. And he said that if you look at the mammals, it indicates that there was a significant boreal climatic conditions during the late Pleistocene. But if you look at the amphibians and the reptiles, you don't see that. He says that they almost represent the same type of environment that you would expect today. Now, what's interesting about that is that we're doing some work right now from Cumberland Bone Cave, and we're finding exactly the same thing. We're finding that the bird fauna and the amphibian and the reptile fauna are very similar to what we have today, but the mammalian fauna is very different. So that's another area of future research that needs to be looked into. The book, The Mammals of Virginia, came out in 1998, and in it is another paper that was done on, they called it the late Wisconsin and mammalian fauna of Virginia. So again, we have more information. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on this except to point out that if you take the different orders of the mammals that are found in Virginia and you compare them to what they call the Wisconsin, and we could also call it the late Pleistocene, and compare it to the modern fauna, you can see the differences that are very similar to what we've already discussed, with one major difference, and that's if you go to the cetaceans. If we talk about the whales and the porpoises, there's only one known from the late Pleistocene, whereas there are 15 different taxa known today. That's a major, major difference. And then I just wanted to show you like a site map. These are the 50 different localities that were in this particular paper. And you can see that the vast majority of those are all along the Appalachian Mountains. So these are faunas that were located in caves and fissures. And if you look at the Chesapeake, you can see there's a depauperate fauna there, simply because we don't have the same resources that we had out in the Appalachian Mountains. You can take a look at individual animals. In this case, on the upper left, we have the mammoth and the mastodons. You can see there's a few from the Chesapeake. If you take a look at Milohyas, which is a peccary, we've only got one in the Chesapeake. If you look at Equus, we only have two in the Chesapeake. If you look at Platygonus, another type of a peccary, we don't have any in the Chesapeake. And you can go on and on. Here we have the caribou. We have one in the Chesapeake. Then we have Butherium, which is the muskox. We have a couple offshore. I wanted to just mention the Cumberland Bone Cave. It's presently being restudied. And the significance of this is that it is not the Chesapeake Bay fauna. It's outside the Chesapeake watershed, but it's probably the most significant Pleistocene fauna that we have in the mid-Atlantic region. So I just felt I needed to mention it so that you were aware of it. This is a study that was first done in 1912. It's now being redone, but out of it, you can see that there's 148 taxa that were identified in this particular fauna, and 25 of those taxa, or 17%, are extinct. The age of this, which is important, is somewhere over 700,000 years. So this is not late Pleistocene. This is middle Pleistocene. And as you would expect, the earlier in age, or we could say the older in age that these are, you would expect for there to be more extinction. And that's exactly what we see with Cumberland. Cedar Island is one of the barrier islands in Virginia. All of the specimens that you see here have been found as float. And what I mean by float is that these are specimens that have been collected by people on the beaches. And these are fossils that are washed up out of the Atlantic Ocean from offshore freshwater peats. And this gives you an idea of the different types of fossils from the late Pleistocene that have been found in that particular environment. Here's another example. This is Elliott Island, which is in the Chesapeake Bay. So this is not on the barrier islands of the Atlantic. But here we have a paleosol that's 24,000 years old. And we believe that these mammalian teeth probably came from that paleosol. But again, they were collected as float. So we don't know positively. But we have a mastodon, we have a mammoth, we have a muskox, and we probably have a bison. Here's a typical example of some of the kinds of things that we're getting in the Chesapeake Bay. If this was Florida, you guys wouldn't even be excited about it. But in the Chesapeake, these are the kinds of specimens that we get excited about because they're rare. So on the left, we have a giant beaver. In the middle, we've got a tapir, and you can see some evidence of the barnacle where this had been in the water. Here's a tusk. You can see some barnacles here. So these are specimens that have probably eroded out of the flooded Chesapeake and now are being washed up on the shore and being collected by various people. And some of these are ending up in some of the collections around the Chesapeake. What I wanted to do is to take a look at some of the late Pleistocene proboscidean specimens because there's 2 mastodons and 1 mammoth, and they have been dated in the Chesapeake. And that's all we've got. We've only got 3 dated specimens. One of them is the Synmar. I think you're familiar with that. It's actually continental shelf. And you can see the date on that is around 28,000. The second one is the Inglewood. This is 24,000. This was found in Maryland, actually very close to Washington, D.C., but still within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And then the third one, it's called the Yorktown mastodon, even though it was really found much closer to Williamsburg, but it's from Virginia, and it's dated at 16,000 years. That's all we've got, 3 specimens. This is the Yorktown specimen. I wanted to show it to you because of the preservation of not just the teeth, but also the tusk and also the bones. In the lower right, you can see some of the ribs. The gentleman who was responsible for collecting that is Gerald Johnson. He did a good job, but I have 2 criticisms. Number 1, he speculates that this was a kill site. And his proof for that is very, very weak. It was simply because of the way that some of the bones had been found in out of proportion. They weren't articulated, and we find that kind of thing all the time. The other thing that he did that unfortunate is that, to the best of our knowledge, there's no published report on this particular site, and they did not do any screening. So if there were any associated projectile points or micro mammals or anything like that associated with a site, they have been lost. So what I'd like to do now is take a look at some sites where there's the possibility of association of extinct megafauna, but I'm going to be right up front at the very beginning that that association is very weak. Paw Paw Cove, we'll talk about it, the Inglewood site, the Gumboro site, Potter's Landing, Parsons Island, and Cactus Hill. I'm not going to talk about Meadowcraft Rock Shelter, which is in Pennsylvania, or Saltville, because they're outside of the Chesapeake watershed. So let's take a look at Paw Paw Cove first. Does someone have a question?
3-minute warning.
Okay, I'm going to go over. I already know that. Here's Paw Paw Cove. What's interesting about this is that float, we have found all of these different late Pleistocene mammals. In situ, we have found these archaeological specimens. Are they associated? We don't know for sure. I'm not saying that they are, but it's interesting. Here's the Inglewood site. You have 2 dates in here that are very close to one another. One's based on a rib, one's based on a fragment. There's a fellow by the name of Carr who in 2015 came out and said that he thought that this was a kill site. Gary Haynes, who was one of the 2 principal investigators that excavated the site, he came out and he determined that there's no evidence of association. So, you pay your money and you take your choice. I wanted to point out who the 2 individuals are that are there, Dennis Stanford and there's Gary Haynes in their younger years. Some of the evidence that they used is Carr says that he thinks this might have been a hammerstone. I think it's very weak. It's only about 3 inches in diameter, and you can see some evidence on the end there that maybe it had been used for pounding, but it's not clear to me. A better possible example is that this is some striations on one of the bone fragments, and you can see the staining of the bone is the same as the striations. So it suggests that if these striations had happened, they happened in a distant time, not in the recent. So these are the two different reports that were done on it. They're not, we can't say that one is better than the other, and there's no positive proof that in fact these are related with association of being a kill site. This is another site. This is at Potter's Landing. We have 3 Clovis points that were found there. This is the actual site located right there. Nothing else. So the question is, why would you find 3 Clovis points found very close to one another and nothing else? Is this possibly a kill site where all of the bone and the ivory and the enamel has now been eroded away because of the high. This is the Gumboro site. This is also been considered by some people a kill site. It's another example where we have 3 Clovis points. Here down below, you can see how close association they are. There is an associated tooth that was found here, but whether it actually means that that came from this individual or not, we really can't say. All I'm pointing out is that we have these anomalies here in the Chesapeake, but there's no positive proof that they're related to kill sites. And then here we have, this is Parsons Island. I know that Darren's going to talk about this tomorrow. I just wanted to point out that here we have bison, we have muskox, and we also have camel. We also have a coyote that's located here. These identifications were made by Russell Graham, who I think is very good in his ability to identify this stuff. And off to the right, you can see a map that shows the dots where we have known muskoxen that have been found on the Atlantic shelf. Interestingly enough, 2 of the points that were recovered at Parsons Island were submitted for blood residue analysis. And 2 of them repeatedly tested positive for bovine and also for camelid blood antigens. So interestingly, we have bones or teeth from the same taxa. Does that mean that there's positive evidence that these were killed by human beings? No, but it's just an incident, just an interesting coincidence. Cactus Hill, another interesting site. Many points have been found there, but just like Parsons Island, they also did blood analysis, and they came up with anti-serum on several of these points that indicated the presence of bison, muskox, elk, deer, and also rabbit. That's quite a diversity there. And then the last example, which is very controversial, is the Synmar. This is found offshore. This is an illustration on the left showing the exit of the Susquehanna River out to the very edge of the continental shelf, shows you the approximate location of the Synmar site. In the dredge that came up from a hard shell clam dredger, you can see the point on the right, and then was also a partial skull, and you can see one of the teeth, and you can see parts of the ribs, and I've got the dates for you there on the left, around 26 to 27,000 years. So here's a quick summary. The Chesapeake Bay has significantly changed geographically in its area, volume, and its depth over time. The evidence of earliest humans in the Chesapeake are rare, in part because of smaller populations and, in fact, fewer occupation sites that are now drowned. The late Pleistocene fauna was more diverse than the 16th century fauna. Much of this is due to the extinction of mammals and the megafauna taxa and the extirpation of other taxa such as the timber wolf, mountain lion, elk, bison, and even the passenger pigeon. The present fauna is somewhat larger in part due to introduced and exotic species such as the Sitka deer and the Norway rat, and even possibly the possum. And while there are several pre-Clovis and Clovis sites with possible association of megafauna in the Chesapeake, association has thus far not been definitely confirmed. Two of these sites, the Inglewood and the Yorktown, and possibly a third, the Synmar, are interesting because they have been found in association with high shell content, which suggests that maybe that's why the bones have been preserved there, and bone preservation elsewhere in the Chesapeake is relatively rare. Virginia overall has done a better job of documenting its Pleistocene, Holocene faunas and the status of the extant fauna from the site. Current research currently being undertaken in Maryland will help to fill the void for the Chesapeake Bay. And lastly, better documentation of the pre-contact human occupation of the Chesapeake Bay will be gained by researching currently underutilized zooarchaeological collections. So with that, I will just close and just make a statement that I really like the idea of comparing three different areas, including the Chesapeake Bay with Florida and the Galveston Bay. Wouldn't it have been interesting to also include something like the Gulf of Maine? Maybe something to think about in the future. A big acknowledgement to Darren Lowry for many of his images, and a thank you to you all.